I am a Christian and I write fiction. Do I therefore write Christian fiction? For me, and I'm not sure that this is true broadly, there's no term as strange and vague as Christian and then insert whatever art form. For most of human history, art was inherently a way of processing and exploring the divine. All art was, and perhaps even is, religious. Today, through many machinations and interesting movements of history, we have arrived at a time in which Christian is a term used for a slice of consumers in the Western market specifically that are primed to buy a specific type of product. How we got here is interesting, I'm sure, but it's also not the purpose of this article and this essay or whatever, and I'm not an expert in that area. What I'm curious about personally, what I'd like to share about in this video, is how we as artists should consider and define Christian art. Or for the sake of what I'm going to be talking about today, I'll hone in exclusively on the art of storytelling and propose how I think we as writers should view the term Christian fiction. I was a senior at the University of Central Florida taking a course titled Advanced Fiction Writing, and the course centered around a capstone project that was something like a 20,000 word short story that we were supposed to revise throughout the entirety of the course, kind of as like a practice in editing and the development of a particular story piece. Nearing my final draft of this capstone project, my professor sat me down in his office and said, "Phil, you are already writing at a publishable level." A publishable level. As someone aspiring to be published in an era where blogging was the only form of real independent publishing, you can imagine the sudden burst of elation I felt at my professor's words. But it was not long-lived. He continued on. He said, "But we really need to tone down this religious stuff." Important context. I was about a year into following Jesus, and I was about as zealous as a new believer could be. Because of a love for Jesus and a deep desire to make Christian fiction, I was pretty heavy-handed with my religious themes in my work. Now, in 2026, a statement like what the professor said would potentially be viewed as inflammatory. But I wasn't insulted, nor did I feel persecuted or whatever. I just felt challenged, and I wanted to understand what the professor meant. We had an excellent conversation that I really do believe formed me very well, and I'm incredibly grateful for that professor and his willingness to push me. You see, my work in that course demonstrated a solid enough understanding of imagery, character development, pacing, etc., but I was so fearful that I would make something secular or meaningless that I was forcing the story that I was writing to take on obvious Christian lessons and allegories that honestly would just make the Kendrick brothers embarrassed. In other words, my stories never rang true. They felt forced and fabricated. They felt like lies. Years later, I think I would maybe rephrase what that professor was saying. It wasn't that I needed to tone down the religious stuff so much as it was that I needed to tell deeply true stories and to trust the Lord to use them. Christian fiction are stories that at the deepest and most fundamental level of human experience are true. In fact, I would just say Christian art is art that at the deepest and most fundamental level of human experience is true. And that's it. That's the grand reveal about what Christian fiction is really. But I do think this definition needs a little bit of expounding, some digesting, and it does contain some nuance and even some problems. So let's dive in a little bit. To tell a fictitious story, a fictional story, means to tell a story that has not, in the literal sense, actually happened. But when a writer sits down and pens a story that has not happened in the literal sense and still aims to capture some deeply true thing about God, others, or this world, he is engaging or she is engaging in a beautiful act of truth-telling. This was my experience as a reader when I finished my first read through of Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. And I cried. This is many years ago. The story of Orwell's journey was fictitious. It did not really happen on the literal sense. And yet it was a near perfect mirror to my own life up to that point. It was true on the level of human experience. It was true in that the story brought me into intimate proximity with the capital T truth. This is art at its most Christian. But the first problem that my proposed definition brings up is this. It does not specify that only Christians can make Christian fiction. But of course, that's implied, right? See, there's a near universal experience that many of us have had when we encounter a piece of art that hits us as very profoundly Christian, but we know nothing about that particular artist's beliefs. Many of us, myself included, hop on Google and we type in, the artist's name, and we say, is he a Christian, or is this a Christian band, or whatever. I remember I did this when I heard 21 Pilots for the first time, and I heard their song "Heavy Dirty Soul," and I thought to myself, "There's no way these dudes don't know Jesus." The thing is that something in us wants to know if these people really are Christian, or if we have just been fooled into seeing something Christian where it hasn't actually been. We want to know, and I think this is not a terrible or bad thing, we just want to know if we're consuming the art in the way that it was intended. And there's something good about that. Sometimes we're happily surprised and we find out that these are brothers and sisters in Christ, and we are viewing the art as it was intended, as an act of a believer making a piece of art. Sometimes we end in ambiguity because it turns out not everything's on the internet, including everyone's religious beliefs, and we just don't know. And sometimes we find that the artist is not only not Christian, but maybe is anti our faith in general. And then we can even feel betrayed in those moments, and feel like maybe we shouldn't have consumed that or be reading that or listening to them in the future. The reality is I cannot always be sure someone who even professes faith in Jesus actually is a believer. And sometimes God just chooses to use non-believers to do his work. I really haven't the slightest clue who are all the people who created the film Schindler's List, but that movie has a profound influence on my imagination, being shaped to be more like what Jesus was talking about in the Beatitudes when he talks about thirsting for righteousness. A lot of that, for me, some of those first foundational imagination building blocks came from that movie. Now, just because someone is following Jesus doesn't mean that they are at a place of maturity, or maybe they're just not called to make art that can dig deep and expose capital T truth. Personally, it took me 10 years of diligently following the Lord and studying my craft of writing before I believe I could partner with the Lord in writing stories that were profoundly true. And in the interim, though well-intentioned, the art that I made was often very unbiblical, and that it was sanitized to the point of often being fake. So just take a moment to see an example of what I mean, and we'll consider two films side by side. Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. I'm a big Star Wars fan, so I feel like I can pick on that franchise a little bit. And the lightsaber duel at the end of Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, is top tier, probably the best lightsaber fight in the series. Fight me. Beautifully choreographed, fantastic cinematography, a killer musical score behind it. But if you think about this or any lightsaber fight just for a second, it's incredibly sad. People engaging in an act of violence so savage as to like literally chop one another into pieces. It is horrific. But the movie doesn't make you think of a lightsaber duel as horrific. On the surface, when viewing the film as it was intended, you see this fight as enjoyable and fun and exciting, so much so that I and tens of thousands of other young boys asked for retractable toy lightsabers for Christmas so that we too could pretend to chop up our brothers and sisters for fun. Violence and death is nothing like Star Wars portrays it. It is, however, much like how the Hunger Games books and movies portray violence. In this series, both the books and the films, death is ugly and death is tragic. And the process of becoming someone who can kill is dehumanizing, so much so that our main character has to see other humans as animals in order to kill them. Getting to know people is the number one thing that problematizes this character's chances for survival in the Hunger Games.
It's okay. You're okay.
To the best of my knowledge, the Hunger Games films did not spawn a line of toy weapons that children wanted to use to reenact death in their own home. Although I am familiar with the rise of Battle Royale video games, but I think that's a separate matter. This isn't me saying Star Wars is terrible and you shouldn't watch it. I'm not saying that at all. It is me saying that Star Wars isn't true art, and thus it's not Christian in the deepest sense of the word. Whether or not a book is made by a Christian or is written before a market of people who identify as Christian is really irrelevant to what I believe the true definition of Christian fiction is. The question is simply, is the story true? Now, it is a fact that one does not have to be a Christian to make something that is true at the deepest and most fundamental level a human experience. But I do think it's the only way to do it consistently. You see, true art is most often created at the intersection of discipleship to Jesus and disciplined pursuit of the craft. When a human is following Jesus as a disciple, and because of a calling from Jesus, they're diligently working to hone their craft, they are bound to create Christian art over and over again. But both discipleship to Jesus and discipline to the craft are vital components. Neither can be sacrificed and still leave a legacy of Christian art as we've defined Christian art here. When there's discipleship but no discipline to the craft, you get art that is poor and flavorless. It turns people away, and rightfully so. Of course, there must be a stage of this in someone's life, and we need a safe community who lovingly bear with us, like my professor in college did. But that community is not loving if they say, this is good, when it's really bad. They are loving when they say, this is bad, but I love you, and I want to help you make it better. Excellence in the craft with no discipleship to Jesus is worse, because it most often, though not always, leads to art that's sweet and deadly. It's like perfectly grown and processed tobacco that's artistic in its creation and presentation, and it's still a carrier of cancer and death. But we do not have to choose a lesser evil. Christians who take discipleship to Jesus seriously will love their neighbor well, and loving your neighbor well means learning the craft. I cannot bake anything. I'm terrible. And so it is not loving for me to bake a cake and ask my community to eat it because I'm a Christian. I either need to learn to bake well and then serve my community through baking, or I need to go do something else. Writing stories is similar. Simply not everyone is called to it, and those who are called will not be good at it at the start. Stories should not be shared widely until the writer has grown into excellence. It simply isn't loving to market a poor book and ask people you don't know to read it. A new writer needs a small group of people who love them enough to read their crappy fiction, tell them why it sucks, then celebrate when the next draft sucks less. And then, after years and years, that once crappy writer will write something that will, for just a little while, make the close-knit community around that person forget who was even the writer to begin with. The story will come alive and the writer will disappear. That is how they know they are ready to write for a wider community. Everyone is called to disciple under Jesus. Not everyone is called to write stories. Those who are called must place themselves under discipline to the craft so that they may serve and love others well.